So you may have noticed from Val and Nicole's announcements, I'm going to be speaking on active compassion today. And some of you may be wondering what I actually mean by that. And as I continue, you may start wondering how that's different from social justice. And basically, I don't think they are that different. I use the term active compassion to describe what leads to social justice. The positioning of our hearts and our minds that would result in lives that are consistently, regularly, reliably marked by justice. I use the phrase to describe what I believe to be the root heart issue that protects us against self-centered living. The opposite of active compassion in my mind is apathy. Active compassion confronts injustice and promotes justice. Apathy turns a blind eye to injustice as long as his or her needs are being met, and thus lets injustice flourish. Active compassion and apathy were issues that I spent some time wrestling with while working on a project for my Old Testament prophets class. We had to research an issue that the prophets were talking about and see how our culture might stand to learn something from it. It was a wonderful class, which quite frankly surprised me. Because I started that class not really a fan of the prophets. The imagery is horrifying, and I found them really confusing most of the time. They don't describe things in a way that someone 3,000 years later understands exactly what it is they're addressing. They don't describe the day-to-day experiences of the people that they're talking to. It's like they expect the people they're talking to know what they're talking about, and the prophets are just saying God's opinion about that. So I knew the prophets talked a lot about idolatry, but not a whole lot else about other issues they talked about. So I took this course in order to find out, get to know them a little bit better, see if I could come to grips with this whole section of the Bible that scared me. And our professor did a great job of leading us through without getting too scared or confused by the imagery. And tonight I'd like to share a bit of that clarity that our professor was able to share with us. Specifically, I've chosen to look at Amos 5:21-24. It's a rough passage, but stay with me. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. So I chose this passage because it makes me pause and it makes me wonder. There's some really harsh language in here, and it's kind of directed to what I thought was an unlikely target. It's one of the passages that I found confusing without any knowledge of the culture of the time. And so I went digging and, of course, praying. Why would God say this? There's a lot of ways of saying that he hates injustice. Why like this? What was going on, and why did God respond with these words? And what can we learn about God, and possibly ourselves, from that? The first part, where God is angry, is often explained away by claiming that it discusses empty religious acts. I'll be coming back to this because I don't think that explanation is entirely wrong. I just think it's missing some important things that might affect our Christianity more than we would like it to. First is that all these things were expressly commanded by God for the ancient Israelites to do. These verses aren't talking about extra rules or extra religious activity that the local priests had pressed onto their people. They're all things God wanted them to be doing. Remember, we're in the Old Testament, so Jesus hasn't come yet to fulfill the law and do away with the sacrifices and the like. They were still supposed to be doing all these things. The second thing I think we should notice is that verse 22 refers to choice fellowship offerings. The problem doesn't seem to be that they're refusing to give their all. By this point, it may feel like the verses are just saying God is impossible to please. But don't worry, that's not the case, and that's not just because of Jesus. Although remembering that Jesus wipes our slate clean and loves giving us fresh starts is certainly helpful when following God's desires for us seems overwhelming. So let's kind of hold on to that. But this is not a sermon on something like the sacrifices that were fulfilled in Jesus and no longer apply to us. Similar thoughts as to those in Amos are expressed in the New Testament, just minus the threat of exile and all the horrifying images. So these religious festivals, offerings, and songs of praise weren't bad in and of themselves, which means that the ancient Israelites hearing Amos's words may have been shocked to hear that God wasn't pleased by their efforts. At some point, a golden calf was built in this town, but Amos makes no mention of this. In the passage I read, there was nothing about God's jealousy or any mention of how the religious festivals should be changed or adjusted, and God was never really shy about pointing that out. So I don't think that's the problem here. I think the point of this message is that the festivals and the assemblies, the offerings and the songs may have been good, but they weren't enough. Because justice isn't optional. It's not an add-on to worshiping God. Without justice, all those good things are worthless. And that thought isn't confined to just Amos. The Old Testament prophets regularly use the words justice and righteousness interchangeably, as if they were synonymous, instead of the dichotomy that we often apply to those words now, where righteousness is an inner private thing between me and Jesus, and justice is an outer public thing that the government and other organizations should take care of. The prophet's treatment of justice and righteousness reminds me of the time that Jesus was asked which was the most important law. He was asked to name one, but he refused. He named two. As important as loving God is, and it is, so is loving our neighbors. Jesus wouldn't let his audience forget that, and I believe that's exactly what Amos is trying to remind the people of Israel. Now we might assume from God's seemingly harsh reaction to the worship without justice and Amos's terrifying metaphors for the injustices that are occurring, which actually include the poor getting their head trampled into the ground, that Israel is filled with like ISIS level injustices. That the blatant good guys versus bad guys you see in the movies, that's what's going on. That these Israelites were divided neatly between the oppressed and everyone else directly oppressing. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Things weren't that rough. Amos was addressing Israel during a time of national prosperity, not a civil war or anything close. The specific injustices Amos actually does accuse them of could be justified from an economic standpoint. In verse 11, just a few verses before the verse I just read, he accuses them of taxing the poor. Many of the injustices of the day were tied to the fact that Israel's economy was based on land that was divided amongst the original 12 tribes of Jacob by God. The land was the basis of Israel's economy, but also Israel's social structure. The land was an inheritance from God, and thus had ties to one's identity or claim to be an Israelite. Your rights and essentially your citizenship were connected to your status as a landowner. But a problem arose as Israel became more prosperous. Some people started accumulating more and more land, thus getting richer and richer. This makes economic sense from the point of view of the rich, and the land wasn't being stolen. People weren't being beaten until they agreed to give their land to some mob boss. It was all done legally. It simply wasn't just. These decisions were made out of apathy and sound economic reasoning, or greed and legally sound advice or something else other than compassion. Compassion for those outside of close family and friends couldn't have been a part of the decision-making process, because by buying someone's land, they and their descendants would remain poor, no way to provide for themselves, and almost more importantly, they'd have no dignity, little to no rights, and no hope. So a few things about this stick out to me. This is all legal. None of these people deserve to go to jail, but God isn't happy. This economy allows or even encourages the rich to get richer while the poor stay poor. It seems it could be rather easily argued that the poor must have made bad decisions or not worked hard, while the rich made good decisions and worked hard. The plight of the landless would have been really easy to ignore or simply stay ignorant of if you had land. These weren't obvious things going on. And most people don't seem to be guilty of collecting the land, but rather of not actively helping the landless. Have I mentioned that this research made me really uncomfortable? As I'm researching this, I keep thinking of our chocolate and coffee and clothing industries, where we don't see it, but the people that are actually making the products aren't treated very well most of the time. And yet, I still participate in those industries because it's easy to forget when you see a sale or a really nice display. You forget what the people are actually going through in order to give you these products. There's a lot of conviction on my part while I'm writing this. Oh my God, I don't really want to write this. I don't really want. Can we skip this? Can we go somewhere else? No. The strong words and the vivid imagery used throughout Amos shows that God has a very strong opinion about things like this. As I touched on before, this isn't something that's actually unique to Amos. You may remember a parable about sheep and the goats. It can be found in Matthew 25. People are divided like sheep and goats, and the sheep go to heaven, and the goats are sent away from God. But do you remember the criteria for distinguishing between the sheep and the goats? That too. It was feeding the hungry, inviting the stranger in, clothing the naked, looking after the sick and the imprisoned. Because whatever we do for the least fortunate, we do for Jesus. And again, the goats aren't described as stealing food from the hungry. They just didn't feed the hungry. It's also a parable of the rich man and Lazarus, found in Luke 16. This parable is a bit more detailed and has lots to say, but I want to focus on just one aspect of it. The parable describes a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. The rich man goes to hell, and Lazarus goes to heaven. And one of the things that strikes me about this parable is that there's no mention of the rich man worshiping another god or refusing to offer sacrifices. The only thing that's mentioned is that the poor man longed for the scraps of the rich man's table and never got any. All Lazarus got were dogs licking his sores. The rich man is not accused of causing the poor man's poverty or being overtly cruel to the poor man. He's accused of simply ignoring him. I believe James, in the second chapter of his letter, is also giving the church similar advice as Amos is giving to the Israelites. This portion of James can sometimes trip us up. It includes the verses, "Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes or daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone." But I believe a key piece in understanding this portion of James will help us understand Amos. And that piece is that James is not talking about salvation. Salvation is a gift and never earned. This is talking about justification, which is the process after salvation of becoming more Christ-like, becoming more righteous. And this process requires more than going to church on Sunday, which shouldn't really be surprising given how Jesus spent his time healing the sick, feeding the hungry, hanging out with those that society had rejected or just ignored. Remember how I said the Old Testament prophets used righteousness and justice interchangeably? Well, the New Testament actually uses the same word for both. The process of becoming your best self, of taking baby steps towards becoming more like Jesus each day, becoming more righteous, requires living a life marked by justice. And not in a legal sense, and not by simply avoiding actively unjust practices, but more of an active social justice stance. By letting God grow compassion in our hearts, but also choosing compassion. Choosing compassion consistently and regularly enough to let it shape our decisions about how we spend our money, our time, our energy. It seems that letting compassion grow and bloom in our hearts and minds until it changes the way we live and the way we speak isn't an additional option to worshiping God. If you want righteousness, compassion so deep it leads to actively searching for the disadvantaged and helping them is required. Without it, we may be saved, sure, but we're not righteous. I mentioned justification as a process. God's not expecting immediate righteousness. In fact, we're not going to reach perfection on this side of heaven. But we can't use that as an excuse not to grow and better ourselves. We must ask God to grow his compassion in us. And we must actively choose the compassionate way of thinking, the compassionate way of speaking, and the compassionate way of acting that moves us to be a little less concerned with ourselves and a lot more concerned with the well-being of the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the disadvantaged. The last aspect that I would like to look at actually happens a little later in Amos. The passage we looked at was delivered to the royal sanctuary in a town called Bethel. This was the place to worship in Israel. Amaziah was the priest there, and we can see his response to Amos in chapter 7. Essentially, he accuses Amos of being unpatriotic. And as far as economic prosperity was concerned, Amos probably did seem unpatriotic. If we remember how easy it was to ignore the injustices of Amos's day, Amaziah's response might not seem so surprising. In today's term, we could think of him as running a massive megachurch. He was really busy. And Amos probably just seemed really annoying. Taking Amos seriously would have been very uncomfortable and made everyone around him very uncomfortable. Just like it likely makes us, if we're really taking his message seriously. I mean, just a few months ago, the Abbotsford Food Bank was critically low in food supplies. Abbotsford has a lot of churches. Dismissing Amos as unpatriotic would be a lot easier. And sometimes I think we all likely do that as well. I mean, maybe just from time to time, but I think we do that to modern day Amoses. Although maybe using words like unrealistic or bleeding heart socialist or humanist or something along those lines. Finally, I'd like to close with encouragement, specifically for those times when compassion hurts. It can be overwhelming when you look at how pervasive injustice is in our world. It can be depressing when change doesn't happen quickly or doesn't seem to be happening at all. It can be heartbreaking when you let yourself truly love someone who's being oppressed, either directly or by social structures like in Amos's day. It can be frustrating and confusing when it seems you have to choose between being accepted in Christian circles and participating in social justice works. So I'd like to encourage you that justice does matter to God. He notices and is so pleased when we step out in compassion and care for the vulnerable and the disadvantaged.